On December the 5th, 1994, the Stone Roses released Second Coming. Then, in March 1995, just 2 weeks before the Second Coming tour was due to start, Rennie, the Roses drummer, quit the band following one of his many clashes with singer Ian Brown.
A spokeswoman for the Stone Roses said a replacement has already been found and the tour would not be affected by his departure. Dates begin at the Talent Farm in Oslo on the 19th of April.
The Stone Roses decided to continue without him, and they recruited another drummer, Robbie Maddox, and they continued to play in this new formation, and that new lineup can be seen performing the song Love Spreads on the 1995 Help album. However, by April the 1st, 1996, a little over a year later, guitarist John Squire had had enough, and he left the band, releasing a statement saying it was the inevitable conclusion to the gradual social and musical separation that we have undergone in the past few years. Ian Brown responded in the press saying he felt cheated and disgusted at John's departure. When asked if there had been a breakdown in communication, especially between himself and Ian Brown, John Squire responded, "That's pretty accurate." The final nudge was a letter from our lawyer saying that positive noises were being made about going back into the studio. I mean, when it gets to that stage, you know it's time to get out of a situation like that. It was no secret that on the last tour, I spent all my time with the crew and that there wasn't much cooperation between me and Ian. And people have said I was stealing the limelight on stage because Ian couldn't sing anymore. But John pinpointed that the problem actually started when Rennie left the band, saying, when he left, the chemistry just wasn't the same. That same day, April the 1st, 1996, John Squire and his guitar tech, Martin Herbert, went out for a night on the town in York to get very drunk. They went drinking at the well-known music venue Fibbers in York, where they watched a local covers band called the Blue Flies, who were performing that night. And that's where he saw Stuart Fletcher, who was a stand-in bass player who'd been drafted into the band at the very last minute. Stuart Fletcher explained it like this: "I'd been asked to dep for a local blues band due to their regular bass player suffering from tendinitis. The guitarist, Miles Gilderdale from Acoustic Alchemy, came round my house on the day of the gig and we ran through the set for a couple of hours before heading off to play. It was the day John Squire left the Stone Roses and he didn't want to be in Manchester. His tech lived in York and they came to the gig. After the show, John approached me and asked if I wanted to join his band. I had no idea who he was, but I was a bit of a band whore and so said yes. It was only after he left that people were coming up to me and asking if I knew who that was. So, having recruited a bass player, John Squire next began looking for a singer for the new band. In an interview, he said this: when it came to looking for a singer, our manager suggested placing an advert in all the suitable magazines. So we did, and the tapes began coming in, but there was nothing there really impressive. The first singer John seriously considered was Sean O'Brien from the Steamboat Band. John said this: as for a singer, I did some work with a guy called Sean O'Brien. I spent a day with him. He sang for a band called the Steamboat Band. I don't think they're still going, but I liked the sound of his voice, and he did a little demo for me of some Elvis songs and they sounded great. We got together and worked for a day on the songs I'd already written, but they weren't quite connecting. It's hard to explain really why it wasn't working. Cut to a shaggy-haired 25-year-old Yorkshire boy, Chris Helm, who was working at Fibbers, where John Squire signed up bass player Stuart Fletcher. He tells it like this: I was broke and started busking outside Woolworths in York. At the time, John Squire was looking to do his own thing after the Stone Roses, and a guy called Dennis, a friend of John's guitar tech, heard me and asked, "Have you got a tape?" So I handed it over, and later on I played a set at Fibbers for John and his guitar tech, Martin Herbert. It was obviously a big deal to me, and I'd had a few drinks to calm the nerves. I went through the tunes and played my set, but I really thought I cooked my goose because after it I would drift up to John and say, "Well, what do you think? Did you like it?" And he said, yeah, you were good, mate. But I did this a couple of times, walking up to John with Nuki Brown in hand, more than a little drunk, and asking him what he thought. And after a few times he just said, for fuck's sake, I've told you once, you were alright. About a week later, I did another gig at the same venue, and John, Adge and Simon Moran were in attendance. At the time, John was actually looking at the singer of the Steamboat Band to set up his new band with. As far as I was concerned, the thing with Squire wasn't happening after my earlier boozy display, so I got up there and just played with the reins off. I just thought, f it, nothing to lose, and went through my set with more confidence in my performance. And it was that night John came up to me and said he was well impressed and really enjoyed the gig. He then set me up a gig at the Roadhouse in Manchester, which was the first solo gig I'd ever played that wasn't in cosy old York. They put me on in the middle of 3 rock bands, but I came away unscathed and the audience were pretty warm towards me. John came up to me at the end and said, do you want to join a band then? And so from busking outside Woolworths to fronting the Seahorses, it was a process of less than 3 weeks. So John brought Chris Helm on board as the singer, but getting from A to B in liking Chris and then hiring Chris was a bit of a drawn out process. John had his doubts and hesitations, and he said the following things. I was a bit worried because Chris closed his eyes when he sang, and only folk singers do that. He sent me a demo originally, but it was really overly folky, and I couldn't imagine anyone standing up and playing it. It was very much a Friday night in a pub sound. I thought, yeah, he can write the odd tune, but I don't really like them, and it might be a problem later on if he wants to record them with the band. Those turned out to be prophetic words from Mr. Squire. John, who, though not 100% fully convinced about Chris Helm, signed him up anyway, but his half-hearted enthusiasm about Helm was apparently clear to Chris right from the word go. This is what Chris Helm said about those very early days. I didn't think I was going to get the position with the band. It was that thing of thinking that you've got something and then you haven't, and then you have, and then you haven't, and then you have, and you haven't, because John couldn't make his mind up. John's manager, apparently, had to say to John, come on, what do you want? Because if it isn't this, then you don't know what you want. And John just said, yeah, okay, you're right, and then I was in. And that was it. But I remember thinking for about a year that at any moment I was about to get booted out. That's probably why I looked so nervous on TV at the time. Someone said to me, in this business, promises are written on the water. And I said, thanks. That gives me a lot of confidence. Once John Squire had officially offered Chris Helm the job after his Roadhouse Manchester gig, this is what happened according to Chris. After I'd gone all the way to Manchester to play at the Roadhouse for him to decide whether he wanted me in the band or not, after that gig we went into John's car and he played me a demo of his tunes. And after that we all went to the Lake District. We were all put on a wage of £100 a week. We used to go there for the week and then we come back on the weekend because there isn't anything to do in the Lake District apart from walkabouts, drink and write music, I suppose. That's what we were there to do. So we actually did buckle down and get a lot done. So, now that the 3 core band members, John Squire on lead guitar, Chris Helm on rhythm guitar and vocals, and Stuart Fletcher on bass, were established, they decamped to Sunnybank Farm, Coniston, Cumbria, where they worked Monday to Friday on developing the band's sound, material, and on getting to know one another a little better. During that time, the first of an endless, never-ending Spinal Tap-esque queue of drummers joined the band. We had a guy called Mark McNeil who was an absolutely amazing drummer, phenomenal. It didn't work out for one reason or another and we ended up being without a drummer for ages. Stuart Fletcher describes those times this way. The early days were great. It was just myself, John and Chris Helm, and there was a real sense of excitement and a lot of writing going on. We were staying in these beautiful cottages in the Lake District with new equipment set up in the living rooms and 4-track recorders in each room. Our first drummer, of many, was a lad called Mark McNeil, who was an amazing player. Unfortunately, however, despite sending him to rehab several times, The drugs won in the end, and John had to make a decision not to proceed with him. Sadly, he had to go, as he couldn't remember anything we rehearsed. Of those early days in Coniston, Chris added this: "Me and Stuart used to spend time upstairs and work on the 4-track, and John would spend time on his own. He never used to sort of play with us. He never liked jamming with us or anything really." Stuart Fletcher adds, "John was not into jamming at all, although he did sometimes sit in. He would record us endlessly and go up to his room. He would take the bits he liked and write parts to it and put structure in, and then we'd work on it again the next day." Rehearsals were also very stop-start sometimes, as John would often be trying new guitars or amps out. He loved the idea of working with Leslie cabs, but because it was John, he had to have about 3 or 4 of them, and they were always cranked up. One of the next things to arrive was the name of the band, and this is how Chris Helm tells the story of that decision. "I remember the journey. It was raining and John was driving us about in the Lake District, and he just said, 'What about the Seahorses?' I just keep seeing seahorses everywhere. In bathrooms there'll be a seahorse soap dish, and there'll be a seahorse's tile. And another thing, I banged my head on a massive blue plastic seahorse when I was in Del Rio's in York, so it's got to be a sign." He used to have this kind of ironic cosmic outlook to life, did John. As, over time, the name of the band became more widely known, various people pointed out that the Seahorses was an anagram for "He Hates Roses." This is what John Squire said about that: "That's pure coincidence. I chose the name because at the time I kept seeing them everywhere, and because some people think they don't exist. They are unusual because it's the male of the species who gets pregnant." During their first drummerless period in the early Coniston days, John Squire's legendary Champagne Supernova slot with Oasis at Nebworth happened, and here is how Chris and Stuart experienced that mythic moment in the history of Britpop. Stuart Fletcher says, "We were invited to Nebworth in 1996 to see John play with Oasis. Chris and I had been told not to mention anything about the band. We were then left in the VIP tent backstage where all the beer was free. Being from York, we then proceeded to drink as much as we possibly could and ended up with so much bottled beer we traded some for cigarettes on Radio 1's tour bus completely off our faces. I think they were slightly confused who we were, but we had all the right passes, so it freaked them out not knowing, and thankfully we managed not to spill the beans." After Nebworth, the Seahorses' second and best known drummer, Andy Watts, was recruited. It was Andy Watts who played on the Seahorses' only completed studio album, Do It Yourself, and this is how Andy Watts tells that story. "We all knew each other from the York scene, apart from John, and he wanted a singing drummer. I was invited to audition at a cottage in the Lakes, and I got the gig. I actually ignored the initial phone calls as I thought it was friends winding me up, and I'd had enough of music at that point in my life. I was very settled in a cosy design job, and I hadn't picked up any instruments for ages. Nonetheless, Andy was offered the gig, and the band started performing shortly after recruiting Andy Watts, playing Stone Roses style secret gigs all over the country. Andy Watts says this about those very first days of playing live: "I can hardly remember the first gigs with the Seahorses. They were very chaotic. It was an exciting time. There was a big buzz about the band. The gigs were meant to be secret, and the management wouldn't let on to anybody where they were. The Greenock gig was my first realisation that it was going to be a big deal. We got such a rapturous reception. Obviously, largely down to John's involvement." The first seed of the Seahorses had been planted on April the 1st, 1996, and by December of that same year, they had a name, a finalised lineup, material written for an album, and some live experience together as an ensemble. So, in December, they went to LA to work on their first album, Do It Yourself. The album contained 3 songs by Chris Helm and 8 by John Squire. Do It Yourself was recorded with Tony Visconti as producer, the man behind classic albums by David Bowie and T-Rex. All in all, the time spent in LA recording the first album seems to have been positive and productive. Following an insane 5-year studio session, making the Second Coming album with the Stone Roses, John Squire wanted to get this one made quickly. They ended up completing it in 30 days. Squire said this about the recording sessions. The fact that I was so desperate to work and the rest of the band was so keen to do well in their new environment meant that there was no need for anyone to crack the whip. Everyone wanted to be there, which was the main contrast with the last album. The times when all the Stone Roses wanted to hang out together in the studio were few and far between. Once the album was completed, a journalist asked John Squire if he believed the Seahorses could make a better album than the Stone Roses, and he replied, "I think we already have." While in LA recording, drummer Andy Watts had begun to set himself apart as a particularly wild member of the band, standing in quite stark contrast to band leader John Squire's more quiet, thoughtful approach. A journalist asked the band what the atmosphere had been like recording in LA. John said, "It certainly felt free and creative. I don't know what it is about the place, but it was like a trip to Spain for me." "It was more like a trip to space for me," said Andy. Of his time in America with the Seahorses, Andy Watts said this: "I was only in the group for about a month, then we flew stateside. I was pretty nervous to start with, going into a very big studio for the first time, ending up in LA, not having worked for ages and all that. We had a laugh, got up to a lot of mischief. Martin Herbert, John Squire's guitar tech, and I often ended up putting bubble bath in the jacuzzi and walking around the studio naked. We partied as hard as we worked. The nightlife in LA is just fantastic. Oh, and then there was me walking through a restaurant naked in DC. John bet me the price of a meal that I wouldn't do it. I did it, and everyone in the restaurant started applauding. It turned out afterwards that the meal was pretty cheap anyway, the equivalent of £20. Select magazine then reported the fact that I'd stripped naked in public for roughly £20, or the dollar equivalent." Once their time in America was completed, the new material was released on Geffen Records. Love Is the Law was the lead single from the album, and it was released on the 28th of April 1997, and it reached number 3 in the UK. The Seahorses' only album, Do It Yourself, was released on the 26th of May 1997, and it got to number 2 in the UK album charts, being held off the top spot by Open Road by Gary Barlow. It also reached number 8 in the United States. Over the course of that year, 2 further singles were released from the album, these being Blinded by the Sun, which came out on July the 14th and reached number 7 in the UK, and Love Me and Leave Me, released on the 29th of September, reaching number 16 in the UK. After recording the album, the Seahorses had a quiet February and March, and then began a brutal, punishing regimen of relentless touring from April 1997, which didn't stop until the end of the year. In that time, they supported some of the biggest acts in rock, including the Rolling Stones, U2 and Oasis. The single Love Me and Leave Me was co-written between John Squire and Liam Gallagher of Oasis. Explaining how that songwriting partnership came about, John Squire said this: "That wasn't a formal songwriting partnership, it was just a late night binge. And Liam had a new guitar, one of his new Lennon accessories. I'd started writing a song and had some lyrics and the chord progression. I gave him the lyrics and he sang them in an Oasis fashion over my chords, and we got the first verse of Love Me and Leave Me before I started falling asleep. It was about 7 in the morning or something, and he was still madly banging, singing out of tune and playing guitar worse than anyone I've ever heard." Shortly before the release of the single Love Me and Leave Me, it was announced that drummer Andy Watts was leaving the group to spend more time with his family. Explaining what actually happened, in later years Andy said this: "I got thrown out. I never left. All that left to spend more time with his family was absolute bollocks. To cut a long story short, we went on a long tour of Japan, and I wasn't getting on that well with John. If I'm honest, I was probably the main protagonist. I was doing too much coke, and it was affecting my playing." Chris said in an interview that I was playing like an arse, which upset me at the time, but looking at it now, he was probably right. I was maybe a little too rock and roll. I liked to party and engaged in many late nights with crew and band alike, which I think perhaps John found inappropriate at times for whatever reason. My partying may have got in the way of my playing. At the end of the tour, Steve Adge told me I was out, and Chris and Stu just went along with what John said, which was what they did at the time. I was kind of to blame for my own downfall. The quote, "having a good time all of the time," springs to mind. However, in a different, slightly less self-effacing interview, he added a little more depth and context to the fallout between himself and John Squire, saying, "It was an eviction due to the fact that I stood up for what I believed in and saw how we were being collectively exploited. I'd endured a degree of abuse, such as being told to drum like a drummer in front of crew and press by John in a rehearsal at the then Terminal Studios in London, when he knew full well my ex-wife had nearly miscarried my eldest daughter Stella. I went off to the toilet and wept. Penny Smith, the photographer, was also there, who took the Clash London Calling album shot, which made it all the more embarrassing. I should have just walked out then. I was asked to sign away my rights from a £1.3 million publishing deal. I've still got the contract in my attic, of which I saw £6,000 when I was sacked. I was told by the management to get a solicitor, who informed me that if I didn't sign the agreement, I'd be out of the band. Combine that with seeing us on the front cover of Select magazine, which was ultimately a metaphor of what was to come, the three of us photoshopped into the palm of John's hand, looking like mini musical minions. It wasn't a great all-round experience, other than playing live. And, to be completely honest, I wasn't performing at my best due to the amount of gear we were all taking, and my realisation one morning in Japan that it was all utterly flawed when the rhythm section were put in separate transport with the crew. There was a lot of discussion at the time about the fact that John Squire had his own tour bus entirely to himself, and the band and the crew were all lumped together in a second tour bus. Here's an interesting reflection from a musical blogger about those times. To be honest, it's surprising the band lasted for 3 years when you hear tales like Squire opting to travel on a separate coach to the rest of the members, choosing to surround himself with his own personal entourage, usually people connected to a cocaine supply, something Squire fervently insists never happened, despite almost everybody he ever worked with verifying his money-burning coke habit. Squire would barely involve himself with the band socially. It was strictly a work commitment, and the band had to accept that they were employees of Squire, not friends. The John versus the rest of the band vibe, unfortunately, didn't stop with just Andy Watts. Everyone else in the band felt it too at some point. When an interviewer asked bassist Stuart Fletcher if he ever spent time with John Squire as a friend, he replied, "I don't think John had friends in any traditional sense. He certainly wouldn't have classed me as one. I respected him a great deal, but he is difficult to have any sort of conversation with. He's really not the hanging out type." As the baby of the band, John used to take out a lot of his frustrations on me. I think in one way he didn't want me to go off the rails like Andy Watts did, so he would constantly have a go at me about putting on weight or showboating on stage. I didn't get it at the time, as I just thought he was a crank, but looking back, I think he was trying to keep it professional. I once asked Beck for his autograph. John tore me a new one. I did find that slightly hypocritical at the time, as he clearly constantly referenced Jackson Pollock in his art and Jimmy Page in his music. Chris Helm said this: "On a personal level, me and John got on all right. It was me and John who would do the press for the band, so I probably spent more time with him than with the others, but it's not like we hung out a lot. We weren't the chattiest of fellas. John was very loud on stage. You know, it's been said that Ian Brown would sometimes struggle singing live, but I've heard Ian sing live a few times, and that guy can definitely sing. I actually think he had the same problem I did, just finding it hard to hear yourself over John's guitar. And then the band all turn up to 11 to compensate with 4 stage monitors each. It got ridiculous and counterproductive. The Seahorses were always too loud. I never really enjoyed playing at that volume. I wanted to be at my best, which was impossible when I couldn't hear a thing that came out of my mouth. When we played Glastonbury, I remember from the second or third guitar riff from John, your teeth were shaking and it went right through you. I saw the camera towards me and I'm thinking, where am I? Am I coming in at the right time? Where's the note? So I would just sing and hope I was in time and in tune with what we were playing. It's quite unnerving and a little selfish really, being that loud. And it was like that for the next 2 years. And it was during that time that I got permanent tinnitus. John Squire, being a quiet, reclusive type of person, didn't only cause tension amongst the band by being a little antisocial, but also by being antisocially loud. Live, the Seahorses constantly struggled to hear themselves over John Squire's cranked amplifiers. Stuart Fletcher said this about touring with the Seahorses. Chris's performance during Love is the Law at Glastonbury was nothing to do with nerves. That was going straight onto a cold, muddy, wet stage with no sound check, and John's guitar so phenomenally loud on stage that Chris had no chance of pitching to anything. We didn't have in-ear monitors or backing tracks, which are so often used now, so it was just pot luck what you got in your wedge. John very rarely plays any root chords as he's constantly riffing, and that just sounds like mush on those stages, in the wind, at those levels. I think most vocalists in those circumstances would sympathise with Chris on that one. After Glastonbury, the Seahorses recorded the standalone single You Can Talk to Me, which was released on the 1st of December 1997 and reached 15 in the UK. The new drummer on the single was a session musician called Mal Scott, who all throughout 2017 stood in for Andy Watts after his sacking. As the band approached, however, the time to begin recording their second album, the tensions between John Squire and everyone else were beginning to grow quite sore. Chris said this: "We just finished playing in Japan. We did a tour with Oasis around Europe, finished that, came and did the UK tour, ended up at the Barrowlands just before Christmas and did 2 dates there. Packed out. And then it stopped. It all stopped because John didn't like the drummer. So John Squire fired drummer number 3, Mal Scott, and Toby Drummond was hired as drummer number 4. And Squire's relationship with Helm, which was arguably the most important one in the band, began at last to seriously deteriorate. And at this point, I think largely out of anger and frustration at John Squire's slightly dictatorial control over the band, the other band members began to no longer hold him in voluntary respect as the band leader, as they watched him make decision after decision that they felt was the wrong decision. The dynamic between John and the band members changed from willing employees to mutinous employees. Chris described these as incredibly traumatic times. Stuart Fletcher said this: "Chris and I had become very close with the then drummer Mal Scott, and I don't think John liked that. He felt Mal was very safe and wanted someone more technical for the new material. That hit us quite hard, as I think it started a bit of them and us, when we really should have been a unit and discussed those sort of decisions together." Chris Helm adds this: "I remember we were playing a gig on the run-up to Christmas at Glasgow Barrowlands. It was the last gig we ever played before we started work on the second album, and we put in a really good performance. Afterwards, John said, 'That was great, Chris, you're a f***ing star.' That really meant a lot to me, but then I realised we'd been together for 3 years, and it was the first time John had ever given me any positive encouragement. After the gig, I came back to York and it felt very strange. I didn't feel like I was home at all. I tried to get my priorities in order, but I just started drinking instead. My head was done in." As the relationship between John and the rest of the band began to seriously deteriorate, John Squire began to vanish down the second coming rabbit hole once again. John replaced drummer Toby Drummond with drummer number 5, Mark Heaney, with whom they began recording demos for the second album, at Olympic Studios in Barnes. They began work with producer David Bottrell in January 1999, and the second album had the working titles of Minus Blue or Motorcade. Stuart Fletcher said this: "I think at this point it also became very clear that John wanted to monopolise the writing of the songs on the album, as that's where the money is, rather than just all working together. This started some kind of competition between Chris and John, with both writing separately and rejecting each other's songs, rather than before, where they would just work together to develop them. I could tell John had become frustrated with the whole thing, as I was having to write 4 or 5 bass lines for every song, as he just wasn't happy with anything. I've listened to some of the alternative versions and I don't think there's anything wrong with anyone's playing, just weak songs, and we were massively overcritical of everything. Of course, that's just my opinion, as you never know what goes on in John's head. He's very hard to read, and you wouldn't ever get him to open up truthfully in interviews, as he's too good at thought out, rehearsed responses." Chris said this: "The Seahorses never recorded a second album. Just like unfinished tunes with unfinished lyrics, and they're all John's songs. It was a really trying time, because I didn't like any of the songs. I told John I didn't like any of them before, and he still ignored me. So it's quite difficult to sing something with feeling and passion, and to get that across if you're not really into what you're doing. So the script was wrong. I couldn't really do it. So that was that. That's where it went wrong." Of those recording sessions, Stuart Fletcher said this: "Were we all happy whilst recording the album? I watched Chris turn a Larivet guitar into matchsticks during that session, so I would say probably not. I think I'd given up by this point," which only added to John's annoyance with the whole thing. Helm admitted in 2011 that he had been unhappy with John Squire writing the majority of the band's material and, therefore, picking up the majority of the band's publishing money. Due to this, he attempted to launch a solo career whilst still in the Seahorses. And allegedly, at John Squire's instigation, the Seahorses management retaliated to this by threatening to sue him if he started touring, playing his own material, whilst still a member of the band. This naturally drove the breakdown in relationship between John Squire and the rest of the band to absolute rock bottom, and Helm began turning to alcohol more and more and showing up for rehearsals unwashed and hungover, as he became increasingly unable to cope with John Squire's distant and very controlling approach to the band. Chris says this: "We got together for the rehearsals for the next album, but the sessions were really strained and John was becoming more and more irritated with me. We'd been touring non-stop since we'd met, and I was drinking heavily and turning up hungover and stinking. John's new material was starting to become something I didn't like, just loads of loud guitar riffing and lyrics that I had nothing in common with. He was too strict and it was all a bit stiff and laboured. The publishers weren't into John's new stuff either, and even the roadies around us were pulling faces and saying that it was below standard. Me and Stu started to feel like we were just session men and there just to finish his songs off, with him picking up all the publishing, and that just didn't feel right. By then, me and John were going 2 different ways, with me being more acoustic and him and his loudness. I started to express my opinions, and John wasn't used to that, but I stuck to my guns. It became apparent that none of us were happy with where we were heading. When asked about when the band finally began to fully disintegrate, Stuart Fletcher said this: "John had written a song called Tomb Raid after the PlayStation game. Chris saw himself as a serious songwriter and didn't want to sing lyrics John had just thrown together about Lara Croft. Chris discussed this with John, and John said he should be able to sing a telephone directory with feeling. Chris disagreed. We sat down and had a meeting, and differences couldn't be resolved, so that was that. Apart from my guitar, which I refused to hand over, all my gear was sold out from under me to pay off debts, which I later learned never existed. Thankfully, my guitar was the only thing I was left with in the end. I actually had more equipment when I joined the band than when I left it, as they sold all my amps. I remember Chris telling me as he walked past a music shop in Doncaster and then walked out minutes later with his own amp. As John was the only member of the band signed to Geffen, we never knew if he had any debt when we separated or if we'd recouped it, as Chris and I never saw any sales figures or band accounts then or to this day. After the conversation where tensions came to a head between Squire and Helm, John Squire walked out of the studio and didn't return. The sessions were abandoned and the group split up. The split of the Seahorses was officially announced on the 23rd of January 1999 with a press release citing musical differences. A spokesman for the band later informed the NME that Squire had become increasingly dissatisfied with the material being produced by Helm until it reached a point where their partnership was no longer possible. Commenting on his reasons for leaving the Seahorses, Squire later said, "I thought, this sounds shit. We don't deserve to be in this place. The band sounded complacent. The band wasn't working out because the singer, Chris, wanted to pursue a solo career in tandem, and there was no way that was going to work for me." When Andy Watts was asked if he thought the Seahorses might reform one day, he just replied simply, "No, there's too much bittersweet history." But when Chris was asked, "Would you make another album with John Squire if he asked you?" he was a bit less definite. He said, "It depends. I would if his songs were any good. I mean, I can't play songs I don't like, and if his songs were absolutely fantastic and were right up my street, then I'd do it, as long as he didn't sit in on the vocals." That was the whole shame about the whole thing. It was just that our musical tastes differed so much. You know, I mean, he's a guitarist. He loves playing that sort of thing. The twiddlier the better. And I hate all that kind of crap, you know. Squire picked relative unknowns for his band, because I think he probably thought it was a bit daunting playing with session musicians who were probably as competent as he thought he was. He always thought it was a competition, you see, being in a band, which it isn't. I remember him saying to me it was a competition, which I always disagreed with. The thing is, you know, I'm really grateful that he asked me to join the band and everything like that, and it was a great experience. I don't think he bargained on us having minds of our own though. So there you go. He should have got session players. In the end, it seems that the problems in the Seahorses were both social and musical. John Squire, being the reclusive, very quiet character, was unable to both lead the band effectively and be as socially withdrawn as was his preference. Squire's original hunch about Helm turned out to be absolutely 100% bang on, because these days Chris is still making great music, but unsigned, acoustic, folk music basically. It's great but very folky nonetheless. And Helm was also right in his feeling about Squire. John perhaps would have thrived and been at home working alongside musicians he viewed as peers and equals rather than subordinates and employees. Had John Squire been able to relate to his band as equals and been able to allow them to have at least one hand on the steering wheel, perhaps the Seahorses would still be going. But maybe it's one of those things. Perhaps John Squire's genius is the upside, the downside being his reclusive hermit nature. And being a reclusive hermit does not go hand in hand with being great socially. Maybe that was just the trade-off you got for John Squire's genius. The bootleg of the 9 tracks recorded for the second album is out there, along with John Squire's artwork for the cover, based on the brilliant but unfinished song Dolphins. And if you managed to get hold of a copy, some of the songs on there had, in my opinion, the potential to be incredible. And one of those songs, called Something Tells Me, was the clearest comment from John Squire that he knew in the midst of those times, very sadly, that his epic britpop indie rock band that had blown away young guitarists like myself nationwide was very sadly over.